Normally you drive from here into
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. But not every day, huh?
That's brutal. I mean, isn't it
It's
hard?
okay.
And
Our
Deanna, the same thing.
manager. Where do you work then?
Well, I was working at John Cabot University.
Okay.
Cosa facciamo, Anna?
Cominciate.
Okay, David,
Okay.
Go.
Right.
Go.
go.
Oh, wait.
What do you think, Jim?
Right. Okay. So I'm going to read you a bit of my book, which was published in 5 years ago. This was so as Pope Francis has now been on the throne of Peter for 7 years. This was published 2 years after he was elected, and I talk a bit about the. I witnessed his election and enthronement, as it were. I remember going to his first press conference, and then I thought, well, if I'm going to write this book, I'd better go to Argentina. I'd never been before in Argentina. I'd been to quite a few places in South America, so I turned up in Buenos Aires and walked around. So that's how I found out. I went to the church where he was where he used to go to mass, and I visited his house and so on. They ran bus tours in Argentina.
That's convenient for you.
So I went on the bus tour.
Yeah.
And that was how it's called first-hand journalism.
As an aside for our international group, my father, having escaped from China when the communists took over, ended up graduating from the American high school in Buenos Aires.
Oh, no. How did he
But that's
get to
another story.
China?
Now,
You
that's
have-
another
an
story.
interesting
Yeah.
story.
Yeah.
Next time.
Next time.
That's fascinating.
Right. Well, I don't know where to begin.
Just start in the middle of a sentence.
Yeah. Oh yeah, this is quite
yeah, why
fun.
not?
Yeah. Well, a bit about his origins. Argentina had been a Spanish colony since the 1580s, and it gained independence from Spain at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1816. Italian emigres had already been arriving in Argentina in increasing numbers since the second half of the 17th century. Today, it's estimated that out of its population of 20 million, 50 to 60% have some Italian ancestry. The Bergoglios and their only child, son Mario, who'd been working for the Banca d'Italia in Turin, made a five-week Atlantic crossing on board the liner Giulio Cesare, arriving in Buenos Aires in January 1928. At that time, Argentina boasted the world's 8th largest economy. But with the onset of the Great Depression, the country was about to plunge into a terrible economic crisis. The newcomers were able to join relatives they had in Paraná, a river port upstream along the River Plate, who had arrived 7 years earlier and set up a company that sold road building materials. These relatives had a 4-story building that they called Palazzo Bergoglio, which had the only elevator in town. 5 years later, Mario Bergoglio, as the father of the boat, trained in Italy as an accountant, married Regina Maria Sivori, a young Argentinian woman, also of Piedmontese origin. The family had by then moved to Buenos Aires, where the two had met in a church. Jorge, our present Pope, their first child, spent considerable time at the house of his grandmother, who was called Rosa, who was now living nearby. Jorge was particularly close to his grandmother, whom he had mentioned many times since his election to the papacy, as his guide and the source of his religious inspiration. Together they used to recite the Rosary, and to this day Pope Francis keeps a letter from his grandmother in his breviary. During a meeting at the Vatican with leaders of the now worldwide Protestant Salvation Army, Pope Francis, speaking in Italian, recalled an incident from his childhood that set him on his lifelong quest to encourage reunification with the other Christian churches that separated them from Rome. First the Orthodox Church at the time of the Great Schism in the 11th century, and then again the Protestants during the 16th century Reformation. Quote, "It was 1940. I suppose none of you were ever born there then," unquote, said the 60-year-old Salvation Army General Andre Cox with a smile. At that time, the general idea was that all Protestants went straight to hell. I remember it as clearly as if it happened yesterday. There were two Salvation Army women with that special bonnet that they wear, walking on the other side of the road. And I asked my grandmother, "Who are they? Are they nuns?" "No," she said, "they are Protestants, but they're good Protestants." So I received my very first lesson in ecumenism from your people. Thank you very much, he added emphatically in his halting English. Because the grandparents continued to speak with each other because the grandparents continued to speak with each other in Italian, albeit in the Piedmontese dialect, Jorge became bilingual in Italian as well as in Spanish. He can, in addition, get by in Latin, German, French, Portuguese and English, though he's uncomfortable when speaking anything but Spanish and Italian. The first stop made by our tour bus, was in front of the childhood home of Jorge Bergoglio. This was number 531 Calle Membrillar, a modest two-story dwelling just 7 blocks from the parish church at Flores, in what was in his time a lower middle-class suburb of Buenos Aires. In 2- and 3-bedroom row houses were mostly of brick. Its 2- and 3-bedroom row houses were mostly of brick, and many, including the Bergoglio home, had small gardens or patios. Reflecting the Spanish style, theirs and many of their neighbours sported ironwork balconies. After the deaths of Jorge's parents, the family home was rebuilt in the 1970s, but its leafy street must always have had dignity and charm. Money was short. Mario Bergoglio worked as a bookkeeper in a factory that made hosiery, and to make ends meet he took on extra jobs. They had no luxuries, no vacations, no car, but there were records of grand opera playing in the background of the traditional Italian game of briscola. After the birth of her last child, his mother suffered from a form of paralysis, and as the eldest son, Jorge, stepped in, learning to cook. So one can imagine the scene in the Bergoglio home, with teenager Jorge hovering over a frying pan. Typically, Bergoglio insisted on installing a hot plate in his modest 3-room suite in the Santa Maria residence in Rome, where he now lives. He had a hot plate installed so he could do his own cooking. While in seminary, he would cook for his fellow future priests on the Sundays when the official paid cook took a day off. Our next stop was nearby, the playground where young Jorge kicked soccer balls with his friends after school. He was never without a ball at his feet, one of his teachers recalled. It was a close-knit family, and his father took Jorge to see matches in which the local San Lorenzo soccer team played. The bus made a zigzag course through the sprawling city, stopping briefly at the places where the future Pope had studied: his elementary school, the technical high school where he'd studied chemistry, and the Immaculada Concepcion seminary, where after working in a chemistry lab on foods for a time, he began his studies for the priesthood at age 21. He told his mother that he planned to study medicine, but he told his mother that he planned to study medicine, but when she found in his room no medical textbooks, only numerous volumes of theology, including many in Latin, she expressed surprise after he acknowledged that he intended to pursue seminary studies full-time. His mother was initially distressed, so say his early biographers. "I thought you were studying medicine," she said. "I didn't lie to you, I am studying medicine, but medicine of the soul," he replied. Anyway, that's the legend, at any rate. The bus passed through the broad streets of downtown Buenos Aires, where on Saturday afternoons couples gathered to dance the tango right in the middle of the street. Here, our guide informed us proudly that Jorge, in his late teens, used to dance the tango, or the somewhat less slinky milonga, con mucho gusto. The image of a tango dancing future pontiff captured the imagination of believers and non-believers alike. On December the 17th, 2014, hundreds of tango dancers gathered in streets around the Vatican to celebrate with music and pontiff and movement the pontiff's 78th birthday. "I like the tango very much as a young man," said the Pope in an interview in 2010. "My favourite singers were Carlos Gardel and Ada Falcon. She later became a nun." It wasn't all fun and tango. In 1957, when he was 21, Jorge fell ill with pleurisy. The illness lasted at least 3 months, and surgeons had to remove a portion of his upper right lung. On her own initiative, a nursing sister tripled his doctor's prescription of antibiotics. He's credited her boldness with helping him to survive what risked being a fatal illness. Now in his late 70s, now in his 80s, he admits that he still feels the effects of this early and permanent impairment of his health. From the venue of street dancing, the bus now took us to the Jesuit seminary, the imposing but rather stark neoclassical Villa Devoto. Jorge entered here in 1958 for training as a future priest. He decided not to become a diocesan priest based in a parish, but to join the elite society of Jesus, the Jesuits. In 2013, Pope Francis, reflecting upon his experience in that seminary, described the environment of his training as closed and rigid thought, more instructive, ascetic than mystical. His teachers left little space for innovation, he said. On the other hand, the Jesuits attracted him. He knew that in undertaking the rigorous 14-year training and series of vows demanded to join the order, he would be living in a deeply committed Catholic community. The order was founded nearly 500 years ago by St. Ignatius of Loyola, a town in the Basque Country of northern Spain, and is among the most prestigious within the Catholic Church. An aristocrat and soldier, Ignatius turned to the life of the spirit after suffering a wound in battle, and in the 1530s he wrote a classic book of meditations, prayers and contemplative practices called The Spiritual Exercises. That book remains extraordinarily influential for many Catholics today, and for Jorge Bergoglio, its spiritual insights became a handbook for life. The impact of St. Ignatius is reflected in Pope Francis's keynote teaching document called Evangelii Gaudium, the Joy of the Gospel, which he wrote in 2013. As an order, the Jesuits were formally recognized by Pope Paul III as the same Pope who would be a protector and a benefactor of Michelangelo in 1540. From the outset, they were missionaries, with about 1,000 Jesuits already working in Europe, Asia, Africa, and the New World by 1556, when Ignatius died. In 1632, the Jesuit missionary Paul Le Jeune sent his first report of missionary work in the New World back to his superiors in France. From Paraguay, the order spread into Brazil, Bolivia, and Argentina in order to convert to Christianity Native American peoples within Spain's empire. The Jesuits first set foot on the River Plate in Argentina over 4 centuries ago in 1585. There, as in the 1986 film The Mission, shown dramatically with music written by Morricone, they found the semi-nomadic indigenous people, the Guarani, in pitiful conditions, exploited by the Spanish colonialists. The Jesuits organized the Guarani into stable communities called reducciones, reductions, and they eventually created 15 missions in Argentina. They were teachers, but also learners. When the Jesuits found local customs in contradiction with Christian teachings, they tried to understand why. For instance, they were troubled that the Guarani killed their sickliest children upon birth, but learned that it was because, as a nomadic tribe, they could not tend to them. Given their missionary work, the Jesuits also became skilled teachers and even businessmen. They were the guardians of the colony's know-how. Astronomers, botanists, pharmacists, printers, zoologists, cartographers, and architects, as well as theologians and jurists. They were admired not just for their knowledge and accomplishments, but also for their discipline and personal austerity, according to Austin Ivory, a friend of mine, a historian of church-state relations in Argentina. They learned to run successful ranches and plantations, akin to the medieval European monasteries. The accumulated wealth from these paid for the construction of Jesuit colleges in all Argentina's major cities, including Buenos Aires. Although the Jesuits protected the indigenous people in South America from slavery, the advent of Portuguese colonization in Argentina resulted in what came to know as the Guarani Wars, fought against the Guarani, who were defeated by the Portuguese in 1756. Back in Europe, the monarchs of Spain, Portugal, and France had become deeply suspicious of Jesuit teachings and power. To them, the Jesuits appeared subversive because of their support for the rights of ordinary people rather than for the divine right of kings. A decade later, all the Jesuits were expelled from the Americas as well as from Europe in what's known as the suppression, which took place everywhere on the same day, April the 2nd, 1767. Ordered by Pope Clement XIV, the suppression lasted until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when the Jesuits were able to return to their missions and schools, including in the Americas. Oh, right. Given these centuries of far-flung missions and their knowledge of languages and grasp of the subtleties of other cultures, the Jesuits came to be considered overly cosmopolitan, highly politicized, and interfering. Their leader was often called the General, reflecting the order's military origins, but sometimes also the Black Pope, not always a compliment. But today, even today, some despise the Jesuits, and the internet harbours various hate sites, like the one offering free anti-Jesuit papacy PDF books, and with such titles as The Engineer Corps of Hell and The Jesuit Conspiracy. Okay, in the 1960s, shall I go on a bit, or would you like to see from some other chapter?
Well, the part that I think is particularly
Interesting.
a part I think is particularly interesting is where he suddenly becomes the head of the church in Argentina. And all the difficulties, because at that time it was a dictatorship.
Right, okay.
Very controversial too.
Indeed,
Very
indeed,
interesting.
indeed.
Because
Well, he had to live through that and survive somehow.
yeah, but they,
By 1986, Bergoglio had been walking a tightrope for a decade, and he found himself in trouble with his superiors in Rome. For them, his 15 years of leadership of the Argentinian Jesuits had become divisive. As a benign form of punishment, they relieved him of his post and dispatched him into temporary exile in Germany, where he was to carry out research for a doctorate. And that's why our next bus stop was at San Jose de Telar, a small modern church in a somewhat upmarket suburb called Agronomea. We were there to see in the church a reproduction of an 18th century Baroque painting of the Virgin Mary, whose original Jorge Bergoglio had admired while he was living in Germany. The painting in the church of St. Peter am Perlach in Augsburg shows Mary flanked by two angels untying a long and tangled ribbon. Underfoot, she crushes the head of a serpent representing the devil. And behind the painting, whose formal title is Mary, Untier of Knots, was the true story of a Bavarian aristocrat. Seeking advice for his failing marriage, he was told by a Jesuit priest to bring him the long white ribbon that Bavarian brides traditionally carry to their wedding. Supposedly it represents Eve's knot of disobedience in the Garden of Eden. And as a symbol, Mary's unraveling of the knot refers to her power to resolve all of life's tangles. The painting left a deep emotional mark on Bergoglio, a stranger in a distant land, and when he returned temporarily from Augsburg to Buenos Aires 6 months later, he brought with him a postcard of the painting. Times changed, and by 1992 the military dictatorship and the dirty war had ended. That year, Bergoglio was ordained auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires, and in the ceremony he distributed prayer cards showing the painting of Mary, Untier of Knots. To honor their new bishop, the San Jose church parishioners then raised money to commission an Argentinian artist to make a full-size copy of the painting. Thanks to its association with Bergoglio, this little church became a popular shrine to Mary, drawing pilgrims from all over Argentina and even from abroad. Tens of thousands of people now converge there every December. The events of these years gave Father Jorge, as he preferred to be called, despite his important new role, a different focus. He became actively involved with the poor and the marginalized, to the point that he was becoming known as the Bishop of the Slums. By 1998, he had quadrupled the number of priests working in the Villas Miserias, the shanty towns, in which some 3 million inhabitants of the Argentinian capital live. As our guide also reminded us, after he was promoted to Archbishop and Primate of Argentina in February 1998, Father Jorge shunned his predecessor's palatial residence in an exclusive neighborhood 14 miles away. He moved into a very modest apartment next door to the cathedral. In its 4 rooms, he could use 3, one being a chapel. In the same way, he decided after his election of Pope not to live in the huge papal apartment on the top of the Apostolic Palace in the Vatican. Exactly as he would when he became Pope in 2013, he adopted a lifestyle and system of church government that represented a sea change by comparison with that of his predecessor. His frugality became legendary. He cooked his own meals and, to visit city parishes, used the bus and the subway. He had so few personal belongings that when a friend gave him a present of some classical CDs, he asked him to record them on cassettes because he didn't have a CD player. When he was made a cardinal in 2001, he chose not to order new robes, but had the hand-me-downs of his late predecessor altered to fit him. He told fellow clerics planning to fly to Rome to see him receive his red hat that they should instead save the price of the ticket and distribute the money to the poor. This was a difficult time for Argentina. Bergoglio's promotion to cardinal happened to coincide with the country's virtual bankruptcy. Between 1998 and 2002, Argentina suffered from a severe economic depression that reportedly reflected financial crises in both Brazil and Russia. In 4 years, the economy shrank by 1/5, and the government defaulted on its foreign debt. Poverty soared. Demonstrators in the Plaza de Mayo died in clashes with the police. At last, our bus headed to its final destination, the neoclassical Metropolitan Cathedral in the now notorious Plaza de Mayo, in the heart of the business district. Just across the square in the Casa Rosada, the palatial pink mansion that serves as the official residence of the Argentinian president. In his cathedral, the new cardinal called upon priests and lay people to work together. Care of the poor and the sick would be a priority. It was winter and 4:30 p.m. Already the sky had turned dark. The official tour was over. Now my own would begin. It began with a walk through the gardens of the vast Plaza de Mayo. Groups of aging army veterans from the Falklands War were standing outside a provisional camp that they had erected. Banners lit by candles were looped between lampposts and bore protests that these veterans had been abandoned by the Argentinian state and left destitute after having fought for their country against the British. On the facade of the cathedral was the new Pope's coat of arms and the crossed keys of St. Peter in stucco. In the foyer stood a large portrait of a beaming Pope Francis. He was the first Pope in history to choose that name. In the text of St. Francis's famous prayer, "Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let's try. Lord, make me the instrument of your peace. Where there's hatred, let me love, let me so love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. And where there is darkness, light. And where there's sadness, joy. Inside the dim cathedral, a few chosen worshippers, mostly women, were praying. I recalled that during the years where Bergoglio was Archbishop, for an annual ceremony marking Argentina's National Day, he received here a delegation representing the highest authorities of the state, but with important exceptions. For years, he had been boycotted by the country's populist president, Cristina Kirchner, who resented his political influence. Far worse, her entourage alleged that he'd been an accomplice of the military dictatorship and even tried to lobby among Argentinian bishops against his election to the papacy. But after his election, when the polls showed that 2/3 of Argentinians admired him, today 95%, in a surprising about turn, Kirchner called upon him 4 times altogether in Rome, where on one occasion the two had lunch together in his home in the Casa Santa Marta. On her return, posters popped up on walls declaring, "We share hopes," with her photo next to the Pope as she offered him a set of porcelain cups for drinking the traditional Argentinian herbal tea, mate. Well, the next morning I went where the bus tour had not gone, to one of the most notorious of the multiple slums of Buenos Aires. This one near the port was called Villa 31, but it changed its name, as we shall see. It was and is considered a dangerous area for outsiders to visit, but I had an introduction to Father Eduardo Drabo, a worker priest who had been ordained by Father Bergoglio. Villa 31 was a far cry from downtown Buenos Aires. The city had been one of the world's major capitals at the end of the 19th century, when Argentina was the world's 4th most wealthy country, a booming frontier land attractive to immigrants. The papal bus tour had taken us down spacious boulevards and through European-style middle-class neighborhoods that still reflect that prosperity. The turn of the 20th century Colón Opera House, built in lavish Art Deco style, is one of the world's largest opera houses and still hosts top international performers. In Villa 31, the poverty-stricken, drug-infested slum that I was now entering, Father Eduardo was carrying on the work begun under under Father Jorge. By telephone, he'd warned me not to take a taxi. It's too dangerous unless someone from here accompanies you. Phone me and I'll pick you up. As I later learned, neither taxis nor police cars would enter Villa 31. We were to meet in front of an auto dealership which boasted a row of gleaming second-hand Porsches and Mercedes-Benzes in its window. Within minutes of Father Drabble's arrival in his beat-up red pickup truck, we entered a warren of box-like shanties and ramshackle two-story buildings, and then quickly arrived at his tiny Christ the Worker church built of cement block and brick. On its outside wall was a touching memorial plaque dedicated to the memory of Father Carlos Mujica, murdered by a right-wing paramilitary death squad after saying Mass in his slumland church in 1974. And so on and so forth. Well, it's a long story. Father Drabble was from a privileged family. His great-grandfather was English and from Scotland and brought shorthorn cattle to Argentina. After studying for a law degree, Eduardo worked as an attorney in Buenos Aires for 3 years, but then abandoned the law to become a priest and was ordained in 2009 by Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio himself. Seated in his tiny office, we observed the ritual often shared with Father Jorge to sit through a straw the rather bitter lukewarm brew called mate. Drabble is a handsome, bearded man of 36, and as he spoke, his face lit up. I'd thought the law was a way to help people, but you can help them more by being a priest, he said. To me, Jorge Bergoglio's finest intuition was to realize that we don't change people, people change us. We grasp that our system is unjust, and as priests we have an authoritative voice. With the strength of our organization, we can support the people. He explained to me how Villa 31 is physically detached from the city of Buenos Aires. On the divided highway between the international airport and the high rises of downtown, I had already noticed huge screens erected to try to conceal or camouflage the existence of some of the worst slums along the route. And similarly, the road to Villa 31 was a broad superhighway soaring above the barrio, making it access to it difficult and indeed invisible to those travelling overhead in the fast lane. In this way, few foreign visitors to Buenos Aires come face to face immediately with the reality of the villas miserias.
Well, I was the one who had suggested that this be what he read, because this is unknown.
Yeah.
No, and it really gives you a picture of who this man is. He's extraordinary. An extraordinary poet, very, very different.
Very different. No, it was a wonderful thing. I've always done the bus tour of places which I visited, if you have a chance, and you discover surprising things.
Very good. Do you have a favorite section or anecdote?
Yeah.
Judith chose that?
Yeah, I got one.
Well, good heavens, I don't know. Let's see. Yes, I would like to read you just a bit about. Funny enough, it's about China.
The Jesuits were quite strong in China.
Indeed.
Very strong in China.
Very strong in China.
Well,
Way back, they were
again,
carrying on.
I did my usual thing when I went to China. I had visited China in the 1950s. 1960s. I went to China for an official visit and saw Mao Zedong and all this. I went into the Great Hall of the People. I spent an amazing 3 weeks in China. As an official, I was assimilated into a group of Hong Kong Chinese journalists. They're too complicated to explain. But it gave me an insight to see China in those days. And they flew us all over the country. I went there. We spent a week in Beijing for the National Day and celebrations, and then they flew us all over the country. They took us to about 6 different cities. We went to Shanghai, Hangzhou. We went right up north to Manchuria. We went to Nanjing, and then we ended in Canton. So I saw the whole scene of, a country where basically people wheeled barrows and went around on bicycles.
Sure.
And there were just a few beat up old Chevys. You know, it was.
Were there any American Hong Kong journalists on that
No,
trip?
no. We were 5 Europeans. There was an Australian woman. There was the editor, an Englishman who was the editor of the Far East Economic Review in Hong Kong.
Here.
And there was me as BBC, and there was who else was there? I can't remember. We were just 5 journalists, and we had one very dramatic in Beijing. We had one very dramatic encounter with I don't know if you remember. There was a British journalist who was sequestered. His name was Tony Gray.
Of course.
He was. Do you remember the Tony Gray?
I remember
And
the story,
we were
yeah.
taken to see Tony. By that time, had been released from prison, but he was living incommunicado in a small flat, and we were able to see him. And he told us about his experiences. So it was quite dangerous to be a journalist. You know, we had minders the whole time.
Very tightly, I'm
We
sure.
were minded, although they were friendly minders, and the tour had its good moments because the food was wonderful. They wanted to show us, the best that China had to
you
offer.
must have had the
So we
banquet
had
after
banquets
yeah.
after banquets after banquets, and particularly one I remember in Shanghai. I will never forget. We had a banquet there, in which they served us one of the specialities of Shanghai, which is drunken crab. You know, they take little crabs and they dip them in alcohol, and the poor buggers die from an excess of drink. And then they boil them immediately and serve them fresh. And they're said to have this amazing taste. Well, it was very good.
Have you had it?
I anyway,
But I'm Shanghainese, so I have all the Shanghai cooking.
Well, you know Shanghai.
Yeah.
No, the Shanghai. We had wonderful Beijing duck Peking, and the food was terrific. And it was a really surrealist trip. We were in Shanghai. They said, "Oh, now we are going to take you to see a capitalist." I said, "What?" The capitalists. I said, "I thought you would abolish those." Yes. No, we think we have. So they took us to see this rather beat up old guy who told us how he had a factory and he was allowed to continue functioning, how happy he was and how happy his wife was. It was, it's surrealist.
He was probably like the precursor to capitalism with socialist characteristics.
That's right. That's right.
We're all getting really cold. Here are the 2 sections on China. One,
2 years I've been here now.
and before that you were in China.
Oh,
No,
yes.
I was in New York actually.
Yes, so I went all.
We both immigrated from New York. He's a New Yorker.
The biggest, this is, I went, so anyway, that was my first trip to China, which was in the 60s. I went back 5 years ago and spent a week in Beijing and saw, I didn't travel all over the country, but I did see, and amongst the things I did was to go and see the local Catholic church, which is still functioning in a suburb, not far from.
5 years ago now.
Yeah.
And how
Well,
you were
listen.
okay with the pollution and
Oh no, the pollution was pretty nasty. But
Yeah.
I had a wonderful trip. It was again, I can't tell you. The biggest challenge facing Pope Francis is perhaps the future of the worldwide church in Asia, the largest continent where 2/3 of humanity lives. After centuries of missionary activity, Christians make up only a minuscule percentage of the total population, 3%. And half of these live in a single country, the Philippines. Spanish explorers and missionaries first arrived there in the 16th century while searching for for the Spice Islands. In January 2015, Pope Francis attracted perhaps the biggest congregation in history, some 7 million worshippers at his Manila Mass. 7 million at one Mass.
Incredible.
As a young Jesuit priest, Pope Francis had wanted to be sent to Japan as a missionary, but he was prevented from doing so by his fragile health after the removal of part of his lung. It was to be expected, therefore, that soon after his election, Bergoglio would inform us, "I must go to Asia." Pope Benedict never set foot in an Asian country during his 8-year pontificate. During his brief stay in Sri Lanka, en route to the Philippines, Pope Francis unexpectedly asked to see a Buddhist temple that wasn't on his scheduled program. While there, he spent half an hour with Buddhist dignitaries who explained to him their rituals and beliefs. As the Pope nears his 80th birthday, a trip to Tokyo may be in the future. Well, in his future it was. He went there last year. I mean, it was a real flying visit. He was only there for 2 days, and the Japanese. We knew the Japanese ambassador to the Holy See, who was sent specifically by the Japanese government to Rome to persuade him to go to Japan, because although there's a tiny proportion of Japanese, wonderful person, and we benefited from this wonderful Japanese food, because he used to serve little banquets for us. He gave a banquet once for me. So it was just him and me and one of his aides. And you were invited.
They were wonderful.
And they produced this sort of 12-course Japanese meal with
Wow.
every little
Top
thing.
Catholic
And at the end of
businessman.
it, the cook, he said, "You
One of
must
the
meet my cook
most
from-
important people
from
in
Tokyo."
one of the most important people in
We
Japan.
did a lot of flying. It was
Fabulous,
wonderful.
fabulous wife.
Anyway, he did actually get to Japan.
Thanks to these guys.
Yeah.
Organization. Yeah.
Asian Catholicism, despite its minority status, displays a vitality and flexibility lacking in Europe. Although Asia's 130 million Catholics represent only 11% of Catholics worldwide, the Church in Asia is growing faster than in any other continent with the exception of Africa. Almost half the population of Asia is under the age of 25, and Asian youth are preoccupied by the same issues that trouble Pope Francis: poverty and income inequality. Officially, the Chinese authorities still regard the Vatican as a foreign power that tries to interfere in China's domestic affairs. Diplomatic relations between the Vatican and China had been broken after the communist takeover in 1950. And today's Catholic Church inside China is split between an underground church that looks to Rome for the qualities of its bishops, and officially tolerated patriotic church whose officials are government appointees. Oh yes, after being granted permission to overfly Chinese territory on both legs of his flight to Korea, he went to Korea separately from this other trips. He held out an olive branch to Beijing. Speaking to Asian bishops gathered near Seoul, that was during his trip to Korea, Pope Francis insisted that the Catholic Church is not present in Asia as a, quote, conqueror, unquote, but as, quote, a partner in dialogue. Father Lombardi explained that this was applied not only to China, but also to other Asian countries with which the Vatican does not have diplomatic relations. that's to say North Korea, Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Bhutan, and Brunei. Interesting, these are countries, all of these, well, not North Korea, but have just Myanmar, Burma has received its own first Pope Francis since this book was written. He appointed a cardinal there in Burma. There'd never been a Burmese one. Laos, I don't think anybody there. Brunei, just the other day, he appointed the first ever Catholic cardinal from Brunei. Brunei is a tiny little enclave in a totally Muslim, in Borneo.
Yeah, I was going to say, how many Catholics?
How many Catholics?
Yeah.
The only Catholics there are just a group of Philippine foreign workers. That's all. There's no. But anyway, he's this business of reaching out to Asia, and I mean, it is not impossible that the next pope will be an Asian.
Yeah.
It could be totally. Yeah. Anyway, I
Well,
think that's.
may I say something now? David's first book, which was very, very successful, was about Italy. But then he wrote a book about John Paul II, JP2, if you call it. And I would like to know what you think about this scandal now about his being made a pope too soon.
A saint.
Too soon a pope.
A saint.
A saint too soon. I wasn't. A saint too soon. What do you
Oh,
think of that?
Pope, looking back on. Yes, I think that there was such euphoria in the church when 1978, when the first non-Italian, we went for 4.5 centuries, there was such euphoria and such surprise that, and such delight that, particularly among the Poles, which people,
Bye-bye.
and he was such a contrast, such a new look in the Catholic Church, that the expectations were very high. I think people didn't dream that the fall of communism this would lead to the fairly rapid fall of communism. But certainly he was a very dynamic figure to the idea of his trips. He travelled so much. You know, he did 105 foreign trips, of which I did 50 with him. Amazing, amazing.
Can you imagine?
And
Were you and Phoebe on a lot of trips together?
yes, I
can imagine,
Yeah, Phoebe and I used to. It was.
I bet you guys
It was
got
very.
into
It was
some
very
rollicking
exhausting.
times.
You know, it was very
Good meals.
exhausting, but very educative. You see, and I always made a habit of, in the early days, I developed my own form of covering the papers. I've always been a first-hand journalist, but I always, I don't just go on official tours. I like to poke around the back, walk up the hill and find out what's going on there. And when we went to Australia, for example, I broke away from the official group altogether and went to visit. I'd always, all my life, wanted to go to Alice Springs. And I flew to Alice Springs, and the Pope was going to arrive later on in the tour. You know, so I'll pick up the party, the official party, and fly on there. So I did, and I had a wonderful time. So it was fascinating.
Come stai?
Come andiamo?
Come andiamo? Bene?
Abbiamo freddo.
Fa
Dice
freddo.
che fa freddo?
Da poveri vecchi, diceva, io non è vero per niente.
Yeah, it's cold. It's
Yeah.
Anyway, so what will happen now that there's an outcry against the sainthood for JP2?
What happened to the, well,
They can't de-saint him.
it's been,
Cannot unsaint him.
it's been,
Devo prendere una copia.
Aspetta, che lascio il libro, non è molto
Pope Francis, Saint, they call him Saint, of course now, Saint, they call him, it's very bulky, I don't like calling him Saint John Paul II, you know, he's officially a saint. Well, they called out this on his death, and they fast-tracked him to sainthood. And I think they realise now it was something of an error, because although he was a trailblazer in certain ways, he also had terrible blind spots. He was so Polish, he was so steeped in the traditions and the traditions of his country, but he didn't really care very much about the worldwide church in the sense of the credibility of the organisation in the face of the clerical sexual abuse crisis. You know, for years I had to cover so many stories. I mean, it began. His attitude was, oh, it's an American problem. No, it was a worldwide problem, and it's only now that they've become aware that he failed rather miserably. And then, of course, I criticise. I mean, he reawakened many of the nationalisms of Eastern Europe in reawakening the Catholicism of Catholic Eastern Europe. He also reawoke a lot of nationalisms of Serbia. I mean, he may have led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, but he also led to the breakup of Yugoslavia with its disastrous consequences, you see. So it wasn't totally successful. However, having said that, he was a remarkable person, and he certainly changed a lot. I suppose, you know, it's just too much to expect that one pope is going to deal with everything, and it had to wait. Benedict, I think, also has much to do. But Benedict had the good grace to leave. I think that, I mean, it's a really funny thing when you think of it, that Benedict will go down in history, really, not for anything much he did, except the fact that he resigned. And it was very important that he resigned, because basically it all got too much for him. And,
But extraordinary that we have two living popes.
well, absolutely. But Francis was certainly represented. We must go. Do you want to borrow my gloves? There you are. Put on
No,
my
I put
gloves.
my own.
No, put on.
I have my own.
Oh, really?
Put them on me.
But I'm cold. The rest of me is cold.
Your whole
They
of
don't
you is
go over
cold.
my
Yeah.
legs.
It is getting a bit cold.
It's getting very cold.
But it was interesting, David. Thank you very
Well,
much.
anyway,
This
so,
is
really
It is. It is.
fascinating.
okay, so you will settle with.
Yes,
with
I will settle. Yes,
for
with
your,
Anna. I will settle with
for your
Anna.
copy. Okay.
E anche oggi devo ringraziarli. Concludiamo.
Ce l'hai una penna, Anna?
Certamente di quello che abbiamo. Eccoci qua.
There are more copies.
Eccoci.
I left that 5 copies.
Siamo
You know
tutti.
why? Because I'll get one too. And
Chiudiamo.
I'm almost thinking it's kind of a shame, having spent the week reading